General James Hawthorne had survived 3 IEDs and a helicopter crash, but the silence of the St. Jude's trauma bay was what finally made him bleed. Known as the Iron Wolf, he lay on the gurney, his uniform a shredded mess of metals and crimson, barking at the hospital director to find the only surgeon capable of a miracle. He expected a subordinate to salute. He expected a veteran who feared his rank. He didn't expect the woman who stepped through the pressurized doors, snapping on her latex gloves with a sound like a gunshot. When Dr. Isabella Romano lowered her mask, the general's heart monitor didn't just spike, it screamed. He didn't just recognize her. He recognized the ghost he had left for dead in a Syrian bunker 5 years ago. As she leaned over him, her eyes colder than the Chicago blizzard outside, Hawthorne realized the terrifying truth. The woman he had abandoned to save his career was now the only thing standing between him and the grave. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The emergency bay doors are nearly torn off their hinges as a military escort swarms the hallway. Outside, a code white blizzard has paralyzed Chicago, but the energy inside is volcanic. General Hawthorne is a wounded lion, swatting away residents and bleeding through his dress blues. He isn't asking for help, he is demanding a legend. He wants the miracle worker, the one surgeon who can stitch a shredded heart in the dark. The hospital director is terrified, sweating through his tie as Hawthorne threatens to burn the hospital to the ground if he loses his leg. The director hesitates because the surgeon the general wants isn't just a specialist. She is a woman who has sworn off the military entirely. 3 floors up, the tone shifts from chaos to eerie stillness. Dr. Isabella Romano sits in a dim break room, her hands still feeling the phantom warmth of her last surgery. When the call comes, she initially refuses. "I don't do salutes anymore, Henry." But when she hears the name Hawthorne, the air leaves the room. This is the man who branded her a casualty of war to cover his own tracks. Isabella doesn't rush to the ER. She moves with predatory grace. She enters the trauma bay and the room falls silent. Hawthorne is delirious, fighting the nurses, until Isabella's voice cuts through the noise like a blade. She doesn't see a hero, she sees a patient she finally has the power to fix, or finish. The sky over Chicago didn't just snow, it screamed. A code white blizzard had turned the skyline into a jagged wall of white static, swallowing the horizon whole. High above the frozen Lake Michigan, the twin rotors of the VH-60N Nighthawk groaned against the gale. General James Hawthorne, known to the Pentagon as the Iron Wolf, sat encased in the plush leather of the transport, his eyes fixed on a digital map. He didn't feel the vibration until it became a bone-shaking shudder. Then came the sound of shearing metal, a catastrophic failure that no amount of maintenance could explain. The descent was a violent, spinning blur of gravity and shattered plexiglass. When the bird hit the slush-covered park 3 blocks from St. Jude's Medical Center, the impact was enough to liquefy the landing gear. Hawthorne felt the shrapnel before he felt the pain, a hot, jagged intrusion of titanium slicing through his dress blues and deep into the pelvic iliac artery. 10 minutes later, the emergency bay doors of St. Jude's were nearly blown off their tracks. "Clear the corridor. Federal priority." The shout came from a Secret Service agent whose suit was shredded and soaked in aviation fuel. Behind him, 4 armed guards flanked a gurney that moved with the frantic energy of a war zone. On it lay Hawthorne. Even with his face masked in a mask of soot and cooling blood, the general looked less like a patient and more like a wounded predator waiting to tear the throat out of anyone who dared touch him. His hands, calloused from decades of command, gripped the side rails of the gurney with white-knuckled fury. "Get your hands off me, you damn amateur!" Hawthorne roared, his voice a gravelly rasp. He lunged weakly at a young resident who was attempting to apply a pressure dressing to his hip. The movement sent a fresh spurt of arterial blood soaking through the white sheets. "Sir, you're losing blood too fast," Dr. Lewis stammered, his hands shaking as he tried to keep pace with the moving gurney. "We need to intubate and stabilize." "I don't need stabilization, I need a professional." Hawthorne spat, a spray of crimson hitting the resident's face shield. "I was told this was the top trauma center in the Midwest. I want the chief. I want the surgeon the senator promised me. I will not have my life flickered away by a boy who hasn't even finished his residency." The hospital director, Henry Cole, came sprinting down the hallway, his tie askew and his face pale. "General Hawthorne, please. I'm Dr. Cole. We are prepping Trauma Room 1. We have our best staff on standby." "Not good enough, Cole?" Hawthorne gripped the director's lapel, pulling him down until they were eye to eye. The general's pupils were blown wide from shock, but his gaze remained terrifyingly sharp. I've heard the rumors. The ghost hand. The one who performs the miracles. If I'm going under a blade, it's going to be hers. I don't care if she's sleeping, I don't care if she's halfway across the city. You get her in this room or I will ensure this hospital becomes a parking lot by sunrise. General, Dr. Romano she's highly selective with her cases, Cole whispered, signaling the nurses to increase the fluid resuscitation. She'll take this one, Hawthorne hissed, his head falling back as a wave of agony washed over him. Tell her the wolf is at the door. Tell her I'm the one who decides who gets funded and who gets forgotten. Now move. The monitors attached to the gurney began a frantic, rhythmic wailing. Hawthorne's blood pressure was cratering, 80/40 and falling. He was drowning in his own internal hemorrhage. Despite the oxygen mask they tried to force onto his face, he kept fighting, his body rejecting the very help he demanded. He was a man used to total control, now facing the one enemy he couldn't outmaneuver: his own mortality. As they wheeled him into the blinding LED glare of the trauma bay, Hawthorne's vision began to tunnel. The last thing he saw was the heavy double doors at the far end of the hall. He expected a savior. He expected a subordinate. He expected the legendary surgeon to bow to the weight of his stars. He had no idea that 3 floors up, Isabella Romano was already staring at the security footage of his arrival, her breath hitching as she recognized the specific ruthless tilt of his head. She wasn't looking at a patient, she was looking at the man who had buried her alive. But as the nurses began to cut away the general's blood-soaked uniform, a nurse gasped, pulling back a piece of the jagged metal she'd just retrieved from his side. It wasn't a fragment of the helicopter's hull. It was small, sleek, and bore the distinct markings of a high-velocity subsonic projectile, a round designed not to kill on impact, but to ensure a slow, agonizing bleed-out that looked like an accident. Hawthorne hadn't just crashed in a storm. He had been executed in mid-air, and the people who fired the shot were likely already inside the building, waiting to see if the surgeon finished the job for them. The water in the scrub sink was ice-cold, but Isabella Romano didn't feel it. Her hands moved with a mechanical, rhythmic precision, fingertips to elbows, bristles against skin, but her mind was 4,000 miles away and 5 years in the past. The sterile scent of the hospital dissolved, replaced by the suffocating copper tang of blood and the smell of burning diesel in the Syrian desert. She could still hear the static of the radio, the desperate pleas for extraction, and the cold, distant voice of the man who had denied them. Assets secured. Medic unit is non-essential. Maintain radio silence. The sensor triggered the water to stop, snapping the silence back into place. Isabella leaned her forehead against the cool tiled wall, her breath hitching beneath her paper mask. She had spent 5 years scrubbing that desert sand out of her soul, reinventing herself as the ghost hand of St. Jude's, a surgeon so clinical she seemed carved from marble. Now the man who had signed her death warrant was 3 floors down, demanding her by name. She pulled on her gown, the fabric rustling like a shroud. Henry Cole had begged her, his voice trembling over the intercom about national security and litigation. Isabella didn't care about his funding or the general's stars. She cared about the fact that the universe had just delivered her executioner to her doorstep, bleeding and broken. The double doors of the trauma bay hissed open with a hydraulic sigh. The room was a hive of controlled panic. Nurses were hanging bags of O-negative at a frantic pace, and the heart monitor was throwing out a jagged, panicked rhythm that filled the space with a high-pitched staccato. In the center of the chaos lay James Hawthorne. Even stripped of his uniform and covered in gore, he looked like a titan. Isabella didn't rush. She moved with a predatory stillness that silenced the room. The resident stepped back, sensing a shift in the atmosphere that had nothing to do with medicine. She stopped at the foot of the bed, her eyes, the only part of her face visible above the surgical mask, locking onto his. Recognition didn't come to Hawthorne in a wave. It hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He stopped thrashing. His mouth opened, but no sound came out as he stared at the woman he had officially listed as killed in action 5 years ago. He looked at the faint, jagged scar that peeked out from the top of her scrub top, a souvenir from the bunker he'd left her in. "You," Hawthorne wheezed, his face draining of what little color remained. The arrogance that had defined him moments ago evaporated, replaced by a raw, naked terror. This wasn't fear of death. It was the fear of a man realizing he was lying on an altar before a god he had betrayed. "No, not you. Anyone else. Cole. Get her away from me." The staff froze, confused by the general's sudden violent reaction to the surgeon he had just been screaming for. Hawthorne tried to heave himself off the table, his blood spraying the floor in a sickening arc. It's a trap. She's not supposed to be alive. Get her out. Isabella stepped into the light, leaning over him until she was inches from his face. The heart monitor reached a frantic crescendo, the beeps blurring into a single long scream. She didn't look at his wound. She looked into his soul, her blue eyes reflecting the cold, unforgiving light of the Chicago storm outside. "Still barking orders, James?" she whispered, her voice a low melodic steel that only he could hear. "But we aren't in Aleppo anymore. Here, I am the only one with the power to decide who is non-essential." Hawthorne's hand flew up, trembling, trying to grab her throat or perhaps to plead, but his strength was gone. Isabella reached out, her gloved hand catching his wrist with a grip that was surprisingly, terrifyingly strong. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. With her other hand, she picked up a syringe of propofol already prepped by the nurse. "No," Hawthorne gasped, his eyes wide as the plunger moved. I won't let you." "Sleep, General," Isabella murmured, her voice chillingly calm as the white sedative surged into his veins. His grip slackened, his eyes rolling back as the chemical darkness claimed him. She leaned closer, her lips brushing his ear as his head fell back against the pillow. "Don't die just yet. I'm not done with you." As the general's body went limp and the room settled into a tense, uneasy silence, the overhead lights flickered once, twice, and then died completely. The emergency red lights hummed to life, casting the room in a bloody, subterranean glow. Before Isabella could make the first incision, a heavy, metallic thud echoed through the ventilation shafts, the sound of the hospital's main external doors being magnetically sealed from the outside. The emergency red lights bathed the trauma bay in a surreal, crimson haze, turning the pooled blood on the floor into ink. Isabella worked in a vacuum of focused silence, the only sound the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator and the mechanical clicking of the hemostats. Around her, the staff moved like ghosts, their shadows stretched long and distorted against the sterile walls. The code white blizzard had effectively cut St. Jude's off from the world, but inside this room the atmosphere was becoming even more claustrophobic. Isabella's hands were steady, deep inside the cavity of the man who had once discarded her like a broken tool. Every fiber of her being screamed at the irony of the moment, but her training, the very training Hawthorne had tried to strip from her, was an immovable force. She bypassed the secondary lacerations, her fingers navigating the treacherous terrain near the descending aorta where the primary bleed originated. "Retract her," she commanded, her voice cutting through the hum of the backup generators. As she cleared the field of excess fluid, she felt it. Her forceps struck something hard, something that didn't vibrate with the jagged, uneven resonance of aircraft shrapnel. Shrapnel from a helicopter crash was usually aluminum or titanium, rough, twisted, and heated. This was different. It sat nestled against the arterial wall with a surgical, predatory intent. With agonizing slowness, Isabella teased the object free. When the metal finally cleared the tissue, there was no clatter into the surgical tray. She held it up to the dim red light, her breath hitching behind her mask. It wasn't a shard of a rotor blade or a piece of the fuselage. It was a pristine, polymer-tipped 300 blackout subsonic projectile. The realization hit her with more force than the blizzard outside. This wasn't a training accident. A subsonic round meant a suppressed rifle, a professional hit designed to minimize noise and maximize internal damage. The helicopter hadn't suffered a mechanical failure, it had been intercepted. Hawthorne hadn't been brought to her as a victim of fate, but as a target who had survived the first shot. "Doctor?" the scrub nurse whispered, noticing Isabella's sudden stillness. "Is everything all right?" Isabella didn't answer. Her mind raced through the implications. If the general was the target of a high-level assassination, then everyone in this room was now a witness. The blizzard wasn't just a weather event, it was the perfect tactical shroud for a cleanup crew. She looked down at Hawthorne's pale, sedated face. He was the only one who knew the why behind the bullet, and currently he was the only thing keeping her alive. If he died on this table, the assassins would have no reason to leave any survivors in the building. With a subtle, practiced motion, Isabella didn't drop the bullet into the specimen jar. Instead, she slid the blood-slicked metal into the small pocket of her scrub top, the weight of it pressing against her chest like a ticking clock. "Close the primary bleed," she ordered, her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "We don't have much time." Just as she reached for the needle driver to begin the internal sutures, the steady hum of the backup generators didn't just flicker. It died. The red emergency lights groaned and extinguished, plunging the trauma bay into a terrifying absolute darkness. The ventilator's hiss stopped, replaced by the ominous, dying whine of cooling machinery. In the sudden heavy silence, the sound of the hospital's pneumatic vacuum tubes echoed through the walls, followed by something far more sinister. The synchronized, heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots moving down the hallway, accompanied by the faint, high-pitched whine of night vision goggles powering on just outside the double doors. Outside the frost-caked glass of St. Jude's, the blizzard had become a tactical asset. Through the wideout, a fleet of blacked-out SUVs skidded to a halt, their tires churning through the mounting drifts. Director Vance stepped out into the biting wind, his face a mask of bureaucratic steel that never quite reached his eyes. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a man managing a crisis, which was exactly why he was so dangerous. Behind him, a dozen men in sterile, unmarked tactical gear moved with the silent efficiency of a shadow. Vance pulled his collar up and keyed a heavy-duty radio. Initiate the seal. Use the Ares protocol. Within seconds, the hospital's external PA system crackled to life, a pre-recorded emergency loop cutting through the panicked chatter of the lobby. Attention. This is a code black. A Category 5 biocontamination has been detected at the crash site of the military transport. St. Jude's is now under federal quarantine. All exits are locked. All communications are jammed for public safety. Remain where you are and wait for the containment team. It was a brilliant lie. To the police outside and the terrified staff within, the lockdown was a protective measure. But as the heavy steel shutters slammed down over the windows and the digital locks on the pharmacy and surgical wings turned red, Vance knew the truth. He wasn't keeping a virus in. He was locking the witnesses in with the wolves. The general is in trauma room 1, Vance said, his voice cold as the ice on the pavement. He looked at the leader of the tactical team, a man whose night vision goggles were already lowered. The bullet is still in him. That is forensic evidence we cannot afford to lose. If the surgeon has already removed it, eliminate her. Secure the projectile, finish Hawthorne, and ensure the contamination leaves no survivors to tell a different story. You have 20 minutes before the local authorities stop believing the biohazard narrative. Inside the pitch-black trauma bay, Isabella stood frozen, her hand still resting on Hawthorne's cooling chest. The absolute silence was more terrifying than the chaos that had preceded it. She could feel the weight of the polymer tipped round in her pocket, the evidence that transformed this accident into a coup. The silence was broken by the clack hiss of the hallway's magnetic fire doors locking into place. Then the faint, electronic chirp of an encrypted comms unit echoed from the corridor. Isabella leaned toward Dr. Lewis, her voice a ghost of a whisper. They aren't here to help him. Get the nurses. Move to the back supply closet. Do not turn on a single light. Doctor, we can't just leave him, Lewis stammered, his teeth chattering in the sudden drop in temperature as the HVAC system shut down. He's still open. If we stay here, we're all open, Isabella hissed, her eyes darting to the translucent glass of the trauma bay doors. A green glow began to bleed through the frosted glass, the unmistakable signature of a laser-aiming module. The tactical team wasn't clearing the rooms. They were sweeping them with the lethal intent of a cleaning crew. Isabella looked down at Hawthorne, the man she hated, the man who had left her to die in the dark 5 years ago. Now fate had reversed the roles. She could slip into the shadows and let Vance's men do what she had dreamed of for years. But then the green laser dot danced across the general's throat, settling right over his carotid artery. In that moment, Isabella didn't see the ruthless general who had betrayed her. She saw a patient on her table, and the ghost hand didn't lose patience. As the door handle began to turn with a slow, agonizing creak, Isabella's hand went not to her scalpel, but to the heavy oxygen tank secured to the gurney's base. She realized that while the hospital was a sanctuary to her, to the men in the hallway, it was a maze of pressurized gases and volatile chemicals, and she was the only one who knew where the fuses were hidden. The green laser dot crawled upward from Hawthorne's throat, illuminating the sweat on his pale skin like a sniper's target. Isabella didn't think. She reacted with the muscle memory of a woman who had survived a collapsing bunker in Aleppo. She slammed her foot down on the gurney's manual release, the metal frame shrieking against the linoleum as she jerked the bed toward the shadows of the utility alcove. "Lewis, get out. Now," she hissed. The young resident didn't need to be told twice. He and the nurses vanished into the darkened sterilization suite just as the trauma bay doors exploded inward. A flashbang detonated with a bone-jarring crack, a white-hot sun blooming in the center of the room. The pressure wave shattered the remaining glass vials on the instrument trays, sending a spray of shards through the air. In the temporary blindness that followed, Isabella didn't rely on sight. She knew this floor by heart. The tilt of the floor, the distance to the service corridor, the heavy weight of the lead line doors. Hawthorne groaned, his body twitching as the sedation began to wear thin under the surge of adrenaline. His eyes fluttered, catching the strobe-like flickers of the tactical lights entering the room. Isabella? He rasped, the name a broken plea. Shut up, James, she growled, her shoulder straining as she heaved the heavy gurney toward the service elevator. I'm saving your life and I'm still not sure why. Behind her, the tactical team moved with chilling silence. The thwip-thwip of suppressed fire chewed through the pillows of the empty recovery beds where Hawthorne had been seconds before. They weren't checking pulses. They were anchoring targets, putting 2 rounds into everything that moved. Isabella reached the service elevator, a heavy industrial beast used for transporting morgue trays and bio-waste. She slammed the manual override, her fingers flying over the keypad in the dark. The doors groaned open with agonizing slowness. There. Movement by the service lift. A muffled voice barked from the trauma bay. Isabella shoved the gurney into the elevator just as a burst of gunfire sparked against the steel frame. She dived inside, hitting the close button and the floor for the basement simultaneously. As the doors slid shut, a heavy thud echoed against the metal, the sound of a tactical boot trying to wedge the gap. The elevator lurched, the cables screaming as it began its slow descent. Inside the cramped, flickering light of the lift, the air felt thin. Isabella dropped to her knees beside Hawthorne. He was bleeding again, the sudden movement having torn the temporary sutures near his iliac artery. You're Lieutenant Romano, Hawthorne whispered, his hands shaking as he reached for her scrub top. His mind was a haze of propofol and shock, drifting between the Chicago blizzard and the Syrian heat. I left you. I had to. The asset. The asset was a crate of hardware, James. I was a human being, Isabella said, her voice devoid of heat. She leaned over him, using her body weight to apply pressure to his groin, her hands slick with his blood. You made a tactical decision then. I'm making one now. I took an oath to do no harm, but that doesn't mean I have to be a victim. She looked up at the floor indicator. The elevator was bypassing the main floors, heading toward the sub-basement where the infectious disease wing and the morgue were located. She knew Vance's men would have the blueprints, but they wouldn't expect her to take the general into a dead-end wing. The elevator shuddered to a halt, but the doors didn't open. Instead, the small digital display above the buttons flickered and died. A deep, mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards, the sound of the elevator's emergency brakes being remotely engaged. Isabella looked up at the ceiling hatch. From the shaft above, she heard the metallic clack of a rappelling carabiner locking onto the cable. They weren't waiting for the elevator to move. They were coming down the ropes to finish the surgery themselves. The elevator was a steel coffin suspended in a void. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy, metallic scent of Hawthorne's blood. Isabella stood in the center of the lift, her ears straining. Above them, the rhythmic scritch-scrape of boots descending the elevator cables sounded like rats in the walls. Vance's team was coming, and they were bringing the silence of the grave with them. On the gurney, Hawthorne's chest heaved. His eyes snapped open, no longer clouded by the milky haze of the sedative. The shock of the cold elevator floor and the sharp, localized agony in his hip had acted like a jolt of electricity to his nervous system. He tried to sit up, his hand automatically reaching for a sidearm that wasn't there. Don't, Isabella commanded, her voice a low vibration in the dark. She pressed her hand firmly against his sternum, pinning him back. Move and you'll rip the iliac. You'll be dead before they even reach the hatch. Hawthorne's gaze fixed on her. In the dim emergency light, her face was a mask of cold iron. The realization hit him, the location, the trauma, the woman. Romano, he rasped, his voice cracking. The hospital, the blizzard. It wasn't an accident, was it? It was a hit, General, Isabella said, pulling the polymer-tipped bullet from her pocket and holding it inches from his face. This was inches from your aorta. Your own people didn't want you to survive the flight. And now they've locked down the building to finish the job. Hawthorne stared at the projectile, the reality of the betrayal sinking in. He had spent 40 years playing the great game, sacrificing non-essential pieces like Isabella to protect the board, only to find out he had been a pawn all along. The Iron Wolf looked suddenly small, a man stripped of his rank and his armor, left with nothing but the ghost of a medic he had abandoned. Vance, Hawthorne whispered, the name a curse. He wanted the intelligence on the Damascus ledger. I'm the only one left who can authorize the de-encryption. He looked at Isabella, his eyes pleading for a mercy he knew he didn't deserve. Isabella? I made a choice 5 years ago. A commander's choice. If I hadn't secured that asset. I don't want your excuses, James. I don't want your remorse, Isabella interrupted, her voice cutting like a scalpel. She reached into a hidden compartment on the gurney, pulling out a heavy, steel manual crank for the elevator doors. You chose the asset. I'm choosing to save the patient. Not because of who you are, but because of who I am. A heavy thud echoed from the roof of the elevator. The ceiling hatch rattled. Isabella grabbed Hawthorne's hand, forcing his fingers to wrap around a heavy oxygen canister. You want to survive? Forget the general. Remember the soldier. When that hatch opens, I need you to do exactly what I say. Hawthorne felt the weight of the canister, his military instincts screaming through the pain. He looked at the woman he had betrayed, the woman who was now his only shield. For the first time in his life, the Iron Wolf followed an order without question. Understood, he wheezed, bracing his good leg against the rail. The hatch above groaned, the metal screeching as a crowbar forced the seal. A sliver of green light from a tactical night vision scope cut through the darkness, sweeping the floor of the lift. Isabella didn't wait. She jammed the manual crank into the door's emergency release and heaved with everything she had, the doors groaning open onto the pitch-black corridor of the infectious disease wing just as a flashbang tumbled through the ceiling. As the elevator became a furnace of white light behind them, Isabella dragged the gurney into the darkness of the hallway, but she didn't run. She stopped at the first heavy, pressurized door marked Biohazard, Level 4. She knew the layout, and she knew the one thing tactical gear couldn't protect against was a doctor who knew how to turn a sanctuary into a slaughterhouse. The air in the infectious disease wing was stagnant and tasted of ozone. Behind them, the elevator shaft echoed with the metallic clatter of the hit squad hitting the floor of the lift. Isabella shoved the gurney through the double doors of the pathology lab, the wheels screeching in the darkness. She didn't turn on the lights, she didn't need to. She knew the chemical inventory of St. Jude's like a soldier knew her kit. James, I need you to hold the pressure on that hip, Isabella commanded, her voice a sharp, clinical whisper. If you pass out now, we're both ghosts. Hawthorne groaned, his face a ghostly white in the shadows, but he clamped his hand over the wound. What are you doing? They have NVG's Romano. They can see our heat signatures through the damn walls. I know, Isabella said, her hands moving frantically across the glass cabinets. Night vision amplification relies on light and heat contrast. So, we're going to give them too much of both. She grabbed 2 large jugs of concentrated acetic acid and a gallon of industrial-strength bleach from the sanitation lockers. Beside them, she snatched a canister of pressurized liquid nitrogen used for cryopreservation. In the dark, she looked less like a healer and more like an alchemist preparing a curse. The ventilation in this wing is on a closed-loop system, Isabella explained, her movements a blur of terrifying efficiency. She began pouring the chemicals into a large stainless steel basin, the pungent, stinging scent of chlorine gas beginning to prickle at the back of her throat. When I tip this nitrogen into the mixture, it's going to create a thick, opaque fog of frozen vapor and chemical smoke. It'll be too cold for their thermal sights and too thick for their optics. You're making a chemical weapon in a hospital? Hawthorne wheezed, a grim, bloody smile touching his lips. Maybe you were always a better soldier than me. I learned from the best at abandoning people, she shot back, but there was no heat in it, only the cold focus of the hunt. The heavy lab doors at the end of the hall groaned. A rhythmic, electronic click-click-click signaled the squad's approach. Isabella waited until she saw the first green glow of a laser sight bleed under the door frame. Now, she hissed. She dumped the liquid nitrogen into the chemical slurry. The reaction was instantaneous. A massive, roiling cloud of white vapor erupted from the basin, expanding with violent force. The fog was so dense it felt physical, a wall of freezing white that swallowed the lab in seconds. The door kicked open. 3 figures in tactical gear surged in, their movements confident until they hit the fog. Through the haze, Isabella heard the panicked garble of their comms. Contact. Visual is 0. My nods are whited out. The night vision goggles, designed to amplify the smallest spark of light, were suddenly slammed with the chaotic refraction of the white vapor. To the soldiers, it was like staring directly into a flashbang that never ended. They stumbled, their high-tech gear becoming a liability that blinded them. Now, James? Isabella yelled. Following her earlier instruction, Hawthorne used his remaining strength to kick a heavy metal rolling cart loaded with glass speakers toward the sound of the voices. The crash was deafening in the confined space. The assassins opened fire, the thwip-thwip of suppressed rounds shattering glass and denting lockers, but they were firing at ghosts. Isabella was already moving, staying low to the ground where the air was clearer. She grabbed a heavy brass fire extinguisher from the wall. Using the fog as a shroud, she appeared like a wraith beside the lead point man. Before he could swing his carbine, she slammed the canister into the side of his helmet. He went down without a sound. She grabbed Hawthorne's gurney, her lungs burning from the chemical haze, and began sprinting toward the only room in the hospital that Vance's electronics couldn't touch. "Where are we going?" Hawthorne gasped, clutching his side as the gurney bounced over the threshold. "The MRI suite," Isabella said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, brilliant light. "They brought guns to a hospital, James. It's time I showed them what 3 Tesla of raw magnetic force does to a man in full tactical gear." As they reached the heavy, lead-line doors of the radiology department, Isabella heard the heavy, metallic stomp of the rest of the squad recovery. They were no longer trying to be quiet. They were enraged. But as she slammed the manual lock on the MRI room, she noticed a flickering light on the wall. The magnet-on indicator was pulsing red. The power hadn't just died. Someone was remotely ramping up the magnetic field to its absolute maximum. The air inside the MRI suite hummed with a low, bone-deep vibration. Even with the hospital's main power severed, the massive superconducting magnets were kept alive by a dedicated cryogenic cooling system, a sleeping giant that Isabella was now waking up. She shoved Hawthorne's non-magnetic plastic gurney into the center of the room, right into the bore of the 3 Tesla beast. "James, listen to me," Isabella panted, her voice echoing off the copper-shielded walls. "Everything metal. Everything. Hand it to me now." Hawthorne, his face slick with cold sweat, fumbled with his belt, unbuckling the heavy brass and steel buckle and tossing his watch into the corner. "You're going to quench the magnet? You'll destroy the machine. The machine can be replaced." "You can't," she said, though her eyes remained as cold as the liquid helium cooling the coils. She moved to the control console behind the leaded glass, her fingers dancing over the manual override. She wasn't just turning the magnet on, she was bypassing the safety limiters, forcing the magnetic field to its absolute, unstable peak. Outside the heavy shielded door, the sound of boots returned, fast, heavy, and rhythmic. The Ghost Squad had abandoned stealth for speed. They knew their target was trapped in a room with no windows and only one exit. "They're here," Hawthorne whispered, bracing himself. Isabella ducked low behind the reinforced console. "Wait for it." The door was kicked open with a thunderous bang. 3 operatives surged into the room, their suppressed carbines leveled, their tactical vests bristling with ceramic plates, steel magazines, and sidearms. They moved in a professional V formation, their boots clicking on the linoleum. "Target acquired," the lead operative barked. But the moment he stepped past the threshold, the world went sideways. The magnetic field didn't just pull, it screamed. The operative's primary weapon, a customized 416 Hong Kong dollars, was wrenched from his grip with such violent force it nearly took his fingers with it. It flew across the room like a guided missile, slamming into the mouth of the MRI machine with a deafening clang. "What the?" Before the second man could react, the steel plates in his tactical vest were caught in the invisible maw of the magnet. He was jerked off his feet, his body flying backward as if yanked by an invisible giant. He hit the side of the MRI unit with a sickening thud, pinned flat against the white plastic casing by several hundred pounds of magnetic pressure. The third operative reached for his sidearm, but the laws of physics were no longer on his side. The steel slide of his pistol locked against his own thigh, pinning his hand to his holster. His tactical knife flew from its sheath, whistling past Isabella's head before embedding itself in the machine's frame. The room was a chaos of flying metal. Scissors, oxygen canisters, and heavy floor buffers from the hallway were being sucked into the room, creating a lethal vortex of shrapnel that circled the 3 trapped men. They were pinned, their own gear turned into an inescapable cage. Every time they moved, the magnetic field tightened its grip on their buckles, their zippers, and the steel toes of their boots. "Cease fire," the team leader screamed, though he couldn't have pulled a trigger if he wanted to. His rifle was now part of the machine's architecture. Isabella stepped out from behind the console, her silhouette framed by the red emergency lights. She held no weapon, only the surgical calm that had earned her the nickname Ghost Hand. She walked toward the leader, who was stuck to the machine like a butterfly on a board, his eyes wide with a terror that no combat training could prepare him for. "In my or I decide who stays and who goes," she said, her voice a low, terrifying silk. She reached into the pocket of her scrub top and pulled out the polymer-tipped bullet, holding it up so the trapped men could see the evidence of their failure. Director Vance wanted a clean sweep. Instead, he got a public record. This room is shielded, your comms are dead, and your gear is useless. And in 10 minutes, when the magnet's cooling system hits the emergency quench, the pressure in this room is going to blow those doors off their hinges. Hawthorne watched from the gurney, a strange, grim respect dawning in his eyes. He had seen Isabella as a liability, a bleeding heart, who didn't belong in his war. But standing there, amidst the wreckage of a billion-dollar hit squad, he realized she hadn't just saved his life. She had conducted a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. Isabella, Hawthorne wheezed, his voice gaining a sudden, urgent clarity. The quench, if the helium vents, will suffocate before the doors blow. Isabella didn't look back. She was staring at the team leader, whose face was turning blue from the pressure of his own vest. I know, James. That's why we're leaving through the service duct. But as she reached for the gurney to move the general, the hospital's PA system crackled to life. It wasn't a recorded message this time. It was the smooth, oily voice of Director Vance, and he sounded like a man who had just found a new way to win. Dr. Romano, you've been very clever, Vance's voice echoed through the suite. But while you were playing with magnets, my team secured the pediatric ward. You have 60 seconds to bring the general to the lobby, or the biohazard protocol will include a mandatory incineration of the 3rd floor. The cold weight of Vance's threat hung in the air, vibrating alongside the hum of the magnet. Isabella looked at Hawthorne. He was a man who had traded lives for assets his entire career, and now he was the currency being used to buy the lives of children. You can't go down there, Hawthorne rasped, his hand gripping the gurney. He'll kill us both the moment he has the ledger. I'm not going to the lobby, James, Isabella said, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. I'm going to the one place Vance can't lie his way out of. She didn't head for the stairs. Instead, she smashed the glass casing of the high-heat fire suppression system. In a hospital, a Category 5 fire alarm didn't just ring a bell. It triggered a massive, automated response that overrode every digital lockdown. Isabella grabbed a heavy metal tray and jammed it into the MRI's emergency quench vent. As the magnets began to fail, the rapid release of cryogenic gases created a massive pressure spike. The fire sensors interpreted the cloud of nitrogen and the sudden heat as a flashover. Simultaneously, the ceiling sprinklers erupted. Thousands of gallons of water began to flood the building, shorting out the jammed communication arrays and triggering a hardwired distress signal to every precinct in Chicago. The biohazard lie was instantly washed away by the sheer physical reality of a massive, building-wide emergency. Outside, the Chicago PD and the fire department saw the strobe lights of the fire alarm. They didn't wait for federal clearance, they breached. The code black shutters were torn open by hydraulic shears as first responders flooded the lobby, forcing Vance's tactical team to holster their weapons or be gunned down by 100 police officers on live television. By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, the blizzard had settled into a soft, shimmering white. The hospital was no longer a tomb, it was a crime scene crawling with federal investigators. 3 weeks later, the lobby of St. Jude's was packed with cameras. General James Hawthorne sat in a wheelchair, his dress uniform pristine, though his face carried the hollowed look of a man who had finally seen his own reflection. The attempt on my life was not an accident, Hawthorne told the gathered press, his voice echoing through the atrium. It was an internal betrayal. But I am not standing here because of military protocol or federal intervention. He paused, his eyes searching the back of the room. He found Isabella standing near the cafeteria entrance, her white coat spotless, her hands tucked into her pockets. I am alive because of Dr. Isabella Romano, he said, the camera swiveling toward her. 5 years ago, I made a grave error in Syria. I left a unit behind. I called them non-essential. I was wrong. Dr. Romano saved me twice. Once on her operating table and once from the very men I trusted. She is the best of us, and I will spend the rest of my life answering for the day I forgot that. Isabella didn't smile. She didn't stay for the applause or the flurry of questions. She felt the weight of the ghost that had followed her from Aleppo finally dissipate, evaporating like the morning mist. She turned away from the flashbulbs, adjusted her stethoscope and checked her pager. There was a fresh trauma coming in from the expressway. A life was on the line and the ghost hand had work to do. Isabella spent 5 years as a ghost because a powerful man decided she was non-essential. Don't let her story go unheard. If you believe that no one should ever be left behind, hit that like button and subscribe to make sure these stories of justice keep being told. Comment redeemed. below if you think the general deserved a second chance, or if Isabella should have walked away.